A blessed day to each and everyone, and let's go with a part 2 of our behavioral statistics, which includes the data structure, research methods, and statistics. This will be our learning objectives. We have to differentiate the correlational, experimental, and non-experimental, and describe the data associated with each. Then we're going to define the independent, dependent, and quasi-independent variables and examples of each. Let's start. Individual variables, rather descriptive research. So when we talk about variable, this is a picture, opinion, a concept that is measured with a certain scale whose value can change. Remember, anything or any concept that can be measured, we call this as a variable. Some research studies are conducted simply to describe individual variables as they exist naturally. If they are existing naturally, then we can have the following example. If a high school official may conduct a survey to describe the studying, sleeping, and leisure habits of a group of high school students. So, if this study had been conducted, then there are results that will be developed. And the results, we call them as numerical score. These are typically described by computing the proportion or percentage, and the non-numerical scores. These are numerical scores are the one that is treated by statistical techniques. And the non-numerical scores, these are the one that are typically described by computing the proportion or percentage in a category. What are the relationship between variables? Most research, however, is intended to examine relationship between two or more variables. For instance, we have to study if there is a relationship between the amount of violence in Mobile Legends video games played by children and the amount of argumentative attitude they display. These have two variables, the violence in Mobile Legends games and the argumentative attitude that they display. The next one, on this statement, the two variables are the nutrition of students and their performances. And the third is the relationship between the sleeping hours and academic performance for postgraduate students. So we have the sleeping hours as one variable, and the other variable is the performance for postgraduate students. So in order to establish the relationship of a variable, we have to make observation, and this is the measurements of two variables. The resulting measurement can be classified into distinct data structures, which help us to classify what research method and statistical techniques are we going to utilize. For data structures, in data structures, we are doing a combination of one group with two variables that is measured by each individual. So what are these? We have the method for examining relationship between variables and to observe the two variables as they exist naturally for a set of individuals. So, for instance, according to Trokel, Barnes, and Eckert in 2000, research has demonstrated a relationship between sleep habits, especially wake-up time and academic performance for college students. The researcher used a survey to measure wake-up time and school records to measure the academic performance for each student. Let's take a look on this figure. So here we are looking at a scatter plot, and the scatter plot shows a clear relationship between the wake-up time and the performances of the students. As wake-up time increases, the academic performances decreases. We call this as a correlational method, wherein two different variables are observed to determine whether there is a relationship between them. Remember, in correlational method, we have two variables and one group. The two variables here, the first variable, we have the wake-up time, and the second variable is the academic performance. What is the statistics for the correlational method? So If the data from a correlational study consists of numerical scores, the relationship between the two variables is usually being measured and described using a statistic called a correlation. So here we can have a classification of a group of college students, and we have the gender. It can be male or female. And if they are male or female, they have a cell phone preferences. It can be either text or talk. So if we're going to make this into convert into numbers, so we can have this data coded with numbers. For example, we can represent males for 50 as 50, and or we can represent male as which corresponds to 0 and female corresponds to 1, so that it is possible for us to compute the correlation. Thus, we can say that the relationship in between variables for non-numerical data, such as what we are seeing in the table, is evaluated using a statistical technique, and this statistical technique is being used as called as the chi-square. What are the limitations of correlational method? So, correlational methods study the existence of relationship between two variables, but the relationship is not being provided. So let's take a look again of the table. We cannot conclude here that the waking time of the students into an earlier time can able to increase their academic performance, or studying more will cause students to wake up early. So we cannot conclude that, because we have to demonstrate a cause and effect relationship between two variables. In order to do that, a researcher must use an experimental method. How are we going to compare two or more groups of scores, experimental and non-experimental methods? So we have to compare two or more group scores. According to Pullman, De Castro, and Van Eegen in 2008, they randomly divided a sample of 10-year-old boys into two groups. So the first group played a video game, and the second one played a non-violent video game. So these are the results. So what happened is the researchers compared their scores for the violent video group with the scores of the non-violent video group. And in evaluating the relationship between variables, they compared the group scores. The values of one variables are used to define the groups, and the second variable is measured to obtain scores within each groups. A systematic difference between the two groups provided evidence for a relationship between playing violent games and aggressive behavior for 10-year-old boys. Statistic for comparing two or more group scores. When the measurement procedure produces numerical scores, the statistical evaluation typically involves computing the average score for each group and then comparing the averages. For example, using text is preferred by 60% of males compared to 50% of females. As before, this data can be able to be evaluated using a chi-square. This data can be used to compare the proportion for males with the proportions for females, wherein we are using the non-numerical data. For the research methods, we have experimental, non-experimental methods, and this distinction between the two research strategies show how the relationship is being interpreted. For the results from an experiment can able to allow to know the cause and effect and the explanation. For if we can say that one variable, if there are changes in one variable, it is being accompanied by a changes to another variable, but we cannot say why. So here we will going to discuss about experimental method. In experimental method, here one specific research method, this involves comparing of group scores, and we are dealing with experimental research strategies, wherein the attempts to show that changing the values of one variable causes changes to occur in the second variable. What are its characteristics. First, manipulation. In manipulation, the researcher can be able to manipulate one variable so that we can change its value from the other variable. So for here, in manipulation, we can control it by giving the group of boys a violent game and the other group to a non-violent game. So we can manipulate the variables. Then we have the control, and here we are controlling the sum situation so that we can ensure that extraneous variables will not going to influence the relationship being examined. What are the general categories of variables that researchers must consider? First is participant variables. We have to take note of the age, gender, intelligence, and they should not vary from each other. So if we are using a group of 10-year-old boys, then that's the one that we're going to utilize. But if we're going to use female, there will be a discrepancy. So if it allows more than one explanation for the results, the study is said to be confounded because it has an ambiguous conclusion. Then we have the environmental variables we have to consider, such as the lighting, time of the day, and weather conditions. We can give the video game to a violent group first thing in the morning, and we can give the non-violent games group late at night. This can able to affect the variables. What are the basic techniques that we going to control other variables? First, we have the random assignment. In here, we're going to control environment variables. So we can assign randomly for testing either in the morning or in the afternoon. That's the random one. Its goal is to distribute the participant characteristics evenly between two groups so that neither group is noticeably smarter or older or faster than the other. Then we have a matching. In matching, we ensure that every group has exactly percentage of male and percentage of female. And holding the concept, in this case, the researchers can be certain that one group is not noticeably older or has a larger proportion of females than the other. So in a constant, here on the table, the researchers use only 10-year-old boys as participants. They're holding the age and gender constant. In experiment method, let's remember that one variable is manipulated while another variable is observed and measured. And to be able to make a cause and effect relationship between two variables, the experiment methods control all other variables so that we can prevent them from influencing each other. The independent variable, this is usually consists of two or more treatment conditions wherein a subject are exposed. So in the dependent variable, it is observed to assess the effect of the treatment. A control condition do not receive the experimental treatment. Instead, what they are receiving is no treatment or neutral. We call this as the placebo treatment. Its purpose is to provide a baseline for comparison with experimental condition. So in experimental condition, we have to receive an experimental treatment. Let's remember, the cause will going to produce independent variable and dependent variable produces the effect. These are the non-experimental method. In the non-experimental method, there's a tendency for people to use the term experiment for a kind of research study. So on the figure that we are seeing right now, this is a non-equivalent groups of study comparison between boys and girls. We have to notice that the study involves comparing two groups, scores like an experiment. However, the researcher has no ability to control which participants go into which group. So all the males must be in the boy group and all the females must be in the girl group. Terminology in an experimental researcher. Although two research studies as shown in the figure are not true experiments, we have to notice that they produce the same kind of data that are found in the experiment, which is often used to identify two variables in an experimental study. So they are creating group, and it is measured so that we can obtain score. By means of manipulation of the independent variable, the participant scores are dependent variable, and the variable that is being used to create groups in the independent variables, and the scores are the what we call the dependent variable. So let's try to take a test on our understanding. In a correlational study, how many variables are measured for each individual and how many group scores are obtained? A, one variable in one group, B, one variable in two groups, C, two variable in one group, or D, two variables and two groups. 2 seconds to answer. The correct answer is, that will be two variables and one group. Number 2, a research study comparing alcohol use for college students in the United States and Canada reports that more Canadian students drink, but American students drink more. What research design did this study use? The research design: A, correlational, B, experimental, C, non-experimental, or D, non-correlational. The answer is non-experimental. And lastly, Stephen, Acton, and Kingston found that participants were able to tolerate more pain when they shouted their favorite swear words over and over than when they shouted neutral words. So for this study, what is the independent variable? It is the amount of pain related. The participant who shouted swear words, the participant who shouted neutral word, or the kind of word shouted by the participants. So here, the correct answer is letter D. So the kind of word shouted by the participants. So that's it for today. Let's all remember that facts are stubborn, but statistics are more pliable. Thank you so much, and I'll be back next week for another another part of statistics. See ya. Thank you, and God bless everyone.